right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us to be a part of this conversation about adult learners. My name is Laila Mcleod. I am new to Michigan. I keep joking that I've slowly made my way around the Midwest. I'm originally from Illinois, lived in Iowa, lived in Ohio. So now I'm in Michigan. I don't know if I'll ever live in Wisconsin, but I think this is it. So I'm super excited to be with y'all today. I'm assistant professor in the higher education program, which is in ed leadership and counseling. This is my first semester here at GVSU, so I'm super excited to have this conversation with y'all. This semester, I teach our course called the Adult Learner, so it's, I think, fitting that I lead this conversation, but by no means do I consider myself an expert. I consider myself someone who's always learning, and I challenge students in this class to really think about who are we talking about when we say adult learners, but more specifically, how the ways that we categorize student populations, how that may perpetuate some deficit thinking or understanding about populations. So that's kind of how I approach this topic. And my hope for our conversation today is really, I have some ideas, but I definitely want to hear from y'all. So hopefully you'll share things that you've learned about working with adult learners or students that we put in this population or this category. And I'll share some things that I've done in my courses. Sound good? So I think we'll begin with a good old Jamboard. Since we're doing stuff virtually now, I'm going to put a link in the chat box. And my initial question here is just what comes to mind when you hear the term adult learner? And I'm going to share, see if we can share the screen so that we can all do this. And how long am I trying to figure out how to share my screen? Can you all see that? Okay, awesome. So question of the day, what comes to mind when you hear the term adult learner? Motivated. Introductory. Non-traditional student, maturity, returning students, night, weekend, part-time student. Context is key. Family and work obligations. So adult responsibilities are juggling alongside their learning. Application-oriented instruction, ROI, yep, topic-related experiences. All right. Self-directed. Okay. They often provide a variety of cultural and educational backgrounds, experiences, responsibilities, and experiences. Okay. Like one more minute if folks want to add some additional thoughts here. Somebody's not letting me do things. Okay. And then non-traditional student over the age of 21 is in the chat. Okay, so these are, I'm going to stop sharing the screen there, but these are some really good comments about who are adult learners. I'm going to share my screen once again and I'll read it out because I know everyone may not have the ability to see this. Okay. So again, when we think about the term adult learners, so the National Center for Education Statistics has some kind of, has terms that they use when they're quantifying who are adult learners or thinking about surveying students who fall in this category. So typically we understand adult learners as students who are over the age of 24, right? So age becomes kind of a default category for this very diverse group of students. Some other definitions that we hear of are students who delayed college enrollment after high school. So those students who don't go straight to a 4-year or 2-year institution right after high school. Some of these students also have dependents or are caregivers of other family members. They work full-time while enrolled. They're financially dependent from their parents. And then lastly, particularly in the course that I teach on adult learners, there are 2 pieces that we read, and I can share in the chat. Sorry, I'm going back and forth between this and the chat. Share a little bit more. This is what happens when you work with too many screens. Sorry, y'all. Thank you for your patience. We read 2 articles that look at the terminology. So someone had put on the Jamboard, someone said they cannot see the slides. Can you see them now?
You're just sharing whatever the screen you're sharing is the one that has your email search in it.
Yeah, not the actual slides.
Yeah, please, because I'm on 2 monitors, feel free to unmute yourself and just let me know because I can't see the chat all the time. So sorry, I didn't see that. The joys of trying to do this at work. But yeah, feel free to unmute in the future because sometimes I may not see it. Let's try this one. Can you see that screen?
Perfect.
This is who are adult learners. Thank you so much. Yes, in the future, please just speak out versus sending a chat message. Okay, so who are adult learners? Typically identified as students who are over the age of 24. Other definitions are delayed college enrollment after high school. They have dependents or caregivers of other family members. They work full-time while enrolled. They're financially independent from their parents or commonly just referred to as students. And so I think it's really important for us to think about when we label a population of any student in a certain way, what are we communicating about who they are? What are the assumptions about the ways that they engage in higher education? And does the student need to be fixed, for lack of a better word, or does the institution need to be mindful of the individuals that it's enrolling? So what would it mean, I guess is a larger question for the group, what would it mean if we just identified adult learners, particularly at a university setting, as students, right? So if we're saying that, we have a bunch of students who work full time, well, does that mean that the university needs to reconsider the way that we structure courses, knowing that we have a population of students who may not be able to attend the typical 9 or 8 to 5 course block that many institutions already have, right? There have been conversations about the availability of childcare on college campuses. And what does that mean again when we have a number of students who are caregivers or have children? Again, when we think about the co-curricular involvement of students, well, what does that mean if we have students who are over 24 and may not find the student organization opportunities on campus to be supportive of what they need as students who are, older than or 24 and older. So again, I think when we think about this term, in addition to the ways that we educate this population, we need to think about the support structures that are in place for them and what assumptions are we making about who goes to college? Because we know there could be, depending on the institution, anywhere from 30 to 40% of the students are 24 of the ages 24 and older. And I think if you look at the history of higher education, that's always not, it's typically been the case for quite some time that everybody high school didn't always exist. But over time, we've always seen a wide range of people that are going to college. This is not a new population per se. I'm gonna head over next to just the 6 assumptions of adult learners. And this goes back to Knowles' 1980 text, The Modern Practice of Adult Education. I noticed that on the Jamboard, someone put the term andragogy. And I know that there's a little debate about that term because the assumption that the word pedagogy applies to children when that's not necessarily the case. It's about teaching techniques. And so thinking about how we understand, yes, adults are different from children, mainly because adults have had more life experience, but it doesn't mean necessarily that we can't use similar techniques to teach both populations of students. But here are some of the assumptions that Knowles kind of introduces us to. So the first one being self-concept, that adults desire more self-directed and independent learning, right? So maybe adults, and again, this is content specific and content specific, right? Thinking about the types of courses that you're teaching. How do you provide opportunities for students to learn at a pace that makes sense for them and to be independent in terms of how they grasp those concepts? Experience speaks to something that I think we're all familiar with, is that adults bring life experience to the classroom. And it's really important that we provide opportunities for them to share that information in the space, right? We never want to assume that students know nothing. So the same thing I tell my students, like, yes, I have a PhD, but I don't know everything. You all bring lots of skills and talents and experiences into this space. Let's learn together. The next one is problem-centered focus. So, and I think specifically in the courses I teach in higher education, students always want to know, how do I make higher education better? How do I make it accessible to all students? So in the classroom, we typically bring up problems that we can solve, or what are some barriers to education? How do we eliminate those barriers or become more aware of those barriers? And then I noticed, again, someone put this on the Jamboard, motivation. When I think about folks that are coming to college, particularly later in life, they're motivated in different ways, right? Maybe they've had a career before, or their children are grown and they're coming back to kind of think about how they want to do things and how their education will fit into that. So we definitely want to tap into the internal motivation of those students. And then lastly, the need to know why they are learning something. And I honestly think this applies to all students, regardless of how old they are and what their life experiences are. I think we need to do, as faculty and folks engaged in teaching, we need to do a better job of explaining to students why we've assigned something. It's not just, in the middle of grading now, it's like, not because I just want to grade for hours on end. I want to make sure that you're making connections between the reading, your personal experience, and your assistantship or your full-time job, and where higher education is going. So in class, when I'm going over the syllabus or reminding them about assignments, it's really important to me to explain to students, okay, I'm having you write, for example, one of my classes, students have to write a paper. The title of it is higher education a public or private good? And I said, it's not just because I want, you to spend hours researching this and, writing these beautiful paragraphs, which is also great, but I want you to have understanding of your field. And also, this is a part of the larger conversations within our country about funding of higher education, right? So if we look at states that are reducing appropriations for higher education, well, what does that tell you about how the state values higher education, right? What does this mean for policymakers? What does this mean for your campus when, there are conversations about minimizing budgets? Well, is higher education a public or private good? Is it both? Is it neither? So giving them the tools to be able to articulate this to different audiences is really important. So that's kind of the explanation I give to why I'm having students do particular assignments. And I think that's really important. So I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment and just open it for conversation about what are some of the opportunities that you all think that adult learners bring to the classroom in your experience?
Well, I'll jump in before the 7 seconds is up here, Laila, and just say that I have, I really like the comment you made about, I got a PhD, but I don't know everything. And that's really a great way to approach your adult learners in your courses, because that's one thing that I've seen in my classes is that we all bring experiences to the table, and it's that opportunity to tell stories within the class that helps us see where concepts that we're teaching in the course can be grounded in actual situations that they're dealing with. And that's really important, because oftentimes it's hard for us to ensure that they see how theory plays into practice, and that ability to have those situations helps out a lot.
I think I'd follow up on Rick's comments to just say there's an opportunity there to let the learners know that you're looking forward to learning as much from them as they are from you, and that this is a community of learners. And it shows an enthusiasm. It models enthusiasm for learning, and that, you know, we're going on an adventure this semester, and we have an opportunity to learn from one another. And I'm really excited because you guys bring so many different experiences to this time together, and I'm really excited about learning from you as well. So I think that's an opportunity you have with adult learners that maybe you don't as much with younger learners.
I think too, I'd say in the class that I teach, I think it's somewhat unique because it's an undergrad class, but because of the topic of the class, it attracts a lot of adult learners who have children of their own, who are interested in how to use technology with their kids, or what research is saying about how technology is affecting kids. And that's always really interesting for a few reasons. Mostly I find interesting because I think like the younger students in the class learn a lot from those students, the adult learners who are willing to share, which is always kind of a tough thing for me. I'm always trying to be very sensitive and not, you know, kind of force them down that road because I don't want to ostracize them to one side. But you know, they almost always, they're very open and sharing. And I think the younger students get a ton out of it, hearing from older students who have kids of their own, who can give really good firsthand experience, and honestly experience that I don't even have, that it really helps quite a bit.
In my PhD program, one of the professors is about to retire, would come to us and say, well, what am I going to learn from you this semester? So he expressed that right up front, and I've carried that through. I did a lot with Justin. Said we have about a 50-50 mix of traditional and adult students, and the adults just give a lot of context and validity to the things we're telling them. They often know what they did, but they don't know why they did what they did, and that's the gap we fill for them. But they also give a credibility gap to the younger students. More than once, we've told younger students how it works in the real world, and they go, yeah. And the adult students say, oh, but that's how it does work. And so it gives a great credit. It feels a big bit of credibility there for us.
As an adult learning student in the classroom, I feel always like the mother hen of the classroom. And I also love to listen to my younger counterparts, and I learn well from them. The professors are really amazing at differentiating non-traditional from traditional, and they do cater to the non-traditional the best that they can.
I was just thinking the theme from maybe the last three comments also indicates that, you know, thinking about, particularly if you use that definition of 24 and over as adult learners, if you're talking about a grad class, almost everybody fits in that, right? But if you're talking about an undergrad at Grand Valley, depending on the class, but sometimes, you know, there's none, or there may be only one or two, and that's going to be a much different situation for that person. You know, if they're this tiny minority versus, you know, that everyone in the class is older. And Rashina mentioned how the instructors recognize this, but that's sort of an interesting, particularly because Rashina is, right, you are taking undergraduate courses. Or are you taking graduate courses? I forgot.
I mingle.
Okay. So you would be a perfectly good, I mean, you would have the best observation of this, of, you know, when you are taking an undergraduate course, how that might differ from when you're taking a graduate course, and how, you know, you're perceiving that, you know, that difference, you know, how the instructor deals with that.
I think too, Laila, you touched on it a little bit, but like the definition is like somewhat problematic, because I'm assuming I used to work in financial aid for a second. So I assume the definition is somewhat tied to the financial aid definition of independent student, which is all the same criteria. But like in reality, in the classroom, it doesn't exactly work like that. It's, you know, you could have, you know, there's nothing stopping you, you know, from having, you know, a 21-year-old who has, you know, kids of their own, you know, and that same type of experience. I think that's, I'm glad that you pointed that out. I think that it's more of like a mindset than it is, like it's a difficult thing to define for sure. And for that this definition to be consistent.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges within higher education. We like for our students to fit into neat boxes, so we know what supports or resources to direct them to. And so, what does that mean when we don't? Like you said, you have a first year student who is a parent and is independent, doesn't live on campus. Okay, so what does that mean for their supports and how you talk to them, right? If you're teaching a first year seminar, what assumptions are you making about the students in that class? And so I'm also really glad to hear that folks have had positive experiences with faculty being mindful of who's in the classroom. And, I think that goes to the examples we give, the assignments that we assign or create, the conversations and the examples that we use. So I'm going to segue to, and hopefully I can get the screen sharing to work again. There we go. Y'all can see this slide. Awesome.
If you're good.
So I wanted to share an example of something I do within my classes. I send out a survey before the semester starts to get a sense of who my students are. So this is beyond just the course, the course list. So this is just one of the examples of the types of questions that I ask. So I ask students like, what's your name? What do you prefer to be called? Do you work on campus? I teach graduate students. So do you work full time? Do you have an assistantship? Where is that assistantship? This particular set of questions is more about technology, right? I've had students who may have never used Google Scholar before, and I want to make sure if I'm talking about these terms or this website, it helps me as I'm preparing the class to know what conversations I need to have or what things I need to emphasize or highlight in the syllabus. So I do think this is one way we can get a better sense of who our students are versus making assumptions that, because I'm teaching an undergraduate course, these are students who are, recent high school graduates, or if they are recent high school graduates, or if they, have worked somewhere else before. So I think this has been really helpful. One of the other questions that I asked towards the end of the survey is, what do you hope to learn out of this class? Or what do you hope to get from this course? And I find that question to be most helpful for me, but it also helps the student become more engaged in their learning, right? So that comment about self-directed learning and motivation, I find that if I know the student is motivated, they're like, I really want to learn about the history of higher ed, or I'm really interested about theory to practice. This helps me in my conversations and course planning and prep, think about, how do I make sure I hit on some of these areas in the class? So I have found the pre-semester survey to be helpful in that way. Just curious, does anyone do this or have any ways that you collect some of this information about your students, either before the semester or throughout the semester, to get a sense of who's in there?
I'll jump in, Laila, and just say that I have used the online. I guess there's a survey that we can ask students to take, and it's kind of measuring their online readiness, which I think is a little different than some of the questions you were asking, which really gets at, your preparation for accessing technology, using the existing technology in your course, et cetera. But most of us shouldn't speak for everybody else, but I do like a begin here module before we actually meet for the first time. And they do some activities that get them into the course and get them, familiar with what's going to happen. But I really love your survey because it's a little more specific than what we've used before with the online readiness. So great idea. Maybe I can steal it from you.
Yeah, and I'm totally fine. If folks are interested, I can share the questions that I asked. If that's at all helpful to anyone, it's totally fine. So, but just curious about what other ways folks gather insight into who their students are.
I do a similar thing, but I also every semester always ask them maybe less of an academic thing as much, but just to get to know them. I always ask them what gets them quote unquote geeked, and I always get really interesting responses from that. And that usually spurs on a lot of good in-class discussions that first in-person meeting we have.
Yeah, something else I do is I ask students to send a meme that describes their feelings about the semester. And that's always fun. I kind of collect them and I'll show them on the first day of class. It's a, I think, fun way to break the ice and tell me a little bit more about their sense of humor and their excitement about the course. And I give an example of a meme that I have. Maybe it's, the frazzled professor, I don't know. But it's really a good icebreaker for the first day of class to kind of think about, what energy are you bringing to the space? And I think particularly for students who I've had who are older, returning, maybe this is their second profession, that they're, second career that they're jumping into, they may have a little bit of nervousness. And for students who are new to higher education, graduate students, that is, they're nervous about graduate school. So again, this is another way to get a sense of the energy and experiences that students are bringing to the classroom. So the pre-semester survey, and also, find a meme or a GIF that explains or demonstrates your feelings about the semester that's coming. So those are two ways that I engage students to get a sense of who's in the space. Anyone else before I move on?
Well, what I usually do is the first day of class, I pair them up. So then they basically interview each other and then they introduce each other to the class. So it's not the person introducing themselves, but their partner. And I usually include some somewhat light questions, but maybe revealing questions, like I asked, to find out what their biggest pet peeve is about taking classes. In other words, what is it they dislike, things like that help elicit that kind of, who they are and what they're thinking about, yeah, so that usually works pretty well and does gather some kind of ideas like that.
And that's a great community builder too, to get students to know each other. It's always a good one. Anyone else?
Another thing I'm thinking about doing next semester, I should say, this kind of came from some other faculty member I talked to earlier this semester, is having students define what success looks like for them in this class, and do it individually, and then kind of having discussion around that. So, because the way I design my class, it definitely can differ person to person. I actually I hope it differs person to person a little bit. So that's another kind of similar type of community building thing. And I also share in my introduction, I have what success looks like for me in the class as the instructor. So I kind of model that as well.
And again, these are great questions because it may be the first time that the student has reflected on that. And I find it's a new way of thinking for students who think success is getting an A. I often have to tell students that an A doesn't always tell me you learned something, right? Which is a shocker for a lot of students. Like, what do you mean? It means I've mastered this content. No, it doesn't. So trying to reshape students' understanding for what success looks like, but also helping them understand that they can determine that. So I really like that example, Justin, of putting shared ownership of learning, because I think oftentimes faculty or whoever's at the front of the classroom is presented as the owner of knowledge and expertise, and helping students understand that this is a group activity, right? So I think that's really powerful. Okay, I'm going to share again. And so, as I kind of mentioned before, in terms of suggestions for engaging adult learners, and I think this also goes back to the 6 assumptions, or Knoll's 6 assumptions, explain the purpose and reasoning behind assignments. I think this is really powerful for students to, again, understand that you're not just having them, write this paper or create this presentation just for the sake of having an assessment of learning, but helping them make real world connections between the content and, wherever they help to go from there, whatever their professional and personal goals are. I also think it's important to include assignments that allow students to reflect on their personal and professional journeys. I think this is particularly true for adult learners because it helps them make sense of who they are and how they want to be in the world, And also it's another way of valuing the experience and the education they already bring to the classroom, right? So I have students in my adult learner class, they have to write a learner's autobiography, right? So how did you come to learn or know what you know? They also have to write a teaching philosophy statement. So in this, the way that I've designed this course, they actually have to develop and present a lesson in class. And I think particularly the students who work in student affairs or higher education don't always think of themselves as teachers or as educators. I have to remind them that your degree is a Master of Education, so you are an educator. But getting them to think about how they approach this idea of teaching, what influences how they've come to be as someone who's imparting knowledge on other people. So I think those reflective assignments, with particular prompts is really powerful for students to see that, I know some things. Everything doesn't have to be written, in a textbook. We talk about embodied learning, that there are certain things that that maybe you can't put your finger on, but you are a producer of knowledge as well. If you don't have these, all these degrees and awards and things like that, you are a knower and a thinker. Using case studies is always, I think, a really important way to engage adult learners and thinking about particularly the examples that you provide. So again, in my program, I have to be mindful that, I have students who are, recent undergraduates and some students who have been working full-time in higher education for quite some time and are now coming back to get this master's. So thinking about using case studies as a way for them to apply what we've read to a real life situation is really powerful, especially when we debrief as a class. You'll see the different ways that students come at that, come at the case, and that's usually based upon experience, right? Like maybe they've seen that example before, and they know the different ways to approach it. And that's a great, as some of you have mentioned in our conversation, that's a great learning opportunity for students who haven't had that experience, right? To hear from their peers, how do you approach a particular situation based upon the experiences you've had? And lastly, being mindful of language and cultural references. I think we haven't again, I think the pre-semester survey, again, helps me understand where students are and that the examples that I'm using in class are as diverse as the students that are in the classroom. As it relates to cultural references, this is something that's come up a lot. Particularly when I have international students in the class, and even when I don't have international students in the class, I'm always mindful of, I cannot assume that everybody has an understanding of US culture or history, right? And I think I've learned this with generational differences. A lot of the cultural examples I use, students have never seen before, right? So as I get older and I'm talking about, I don't know, even something to me as simple as The Simpsons, there are students who are like, nope, never seen it. Or if I use my Ferris Bueller's Day Off example, they're like, nope, never seen it. So just being but my older students were like, yes, I was there with you, right? So just being mindful of who's in the classroom. And it's also a reminder to me to talk to my son to get more current examples that students may connect with. So I think generational differences in the classroom are a gift to all of us, because I think sometimes our students, again, thinking about students I work with who are in higher education, is that all of you aren't going to work with 18 to 24-year-olds, right? So you also have to be mindful of the students that you will be working with and their different needs and their different ways of moving in the world. So it's modeling for, I'm learning, but also modeling for them the assumptions we make about who is an adult learner, or who our students are in general. So that's kind of what I was thinking about in terms of some suggestions. I'm just curious if there's anything that's worked for y'all with engaging adult learners in your classrooms that you'd like to share.
I'll start. We do many of the things you mentioned in our program. We find that the application is always engaging for them. So we do case studies. We also do simulations that, take the case study a next level higher. But anytime we can apply it, it makes sense for our students. I'll need to tell you one little funny thing. So I was doing the problem with students, and something came up, and they said, "Oh, that's from Grey's Anatomy." I said, "Oh, I've never seen Grey's Anatomy." I said, "Is that like Marcus Welby?" I said, "Who's that?" So you got to keep your culture, your age, I guess, came out there in that one.
And that's a good example of when a student does bring an example that I'm not aware of, to help them understand how to talk about it more, right? So I always say, if a student introduces something I haven't heard of, I say, okay, talk us through that. Like, because that may be something that your peers can use in connection with somebody else, or that they'll go back and look at. So again, that's a great example of ways to engage in some of those intergenerational or cross-cultural conversations in the classroom, for sure.
Say one thing I do in the beginning of my class is that I ask all my students, it's a gen ed class, so it's not all, education majors necessarily. And I ask them, how will you be an educator? So I to give this big whole thing about how I think everyone's an educator to some degree. And it kind of defines, like how this information is immediately applicable to them, or at least in the future applicable to them. So going back to your immediacy of use, I think that helps people see, because inevitably then somebody's like, oh well, I have a younger sibling, or I have nieces or nephews or something like that, and it makes it applicable as opposed to just a class that is for future teachers, which I've always found to be really, really helpful. And I think that is probably true of almost all most potential professions within the college. I think there's even. Yeah, I know that's mostly professional programs and people looking to do this professionally, but I think just thinking about that more broadly is helpful for students.
Because we are and many of us are in professional programs. I think one of the things that I've noticed over the years that my adult learners appreciate is a certain sense of vulnerability from me as an instructor, in terms of being willing to share mistakes I've made on the journey, difficult situations I had to navigate as a professional, just being real with them, because they can identify with that, because everybody comes up against obstacles and challenges. And I remember a particular class when I just felt for some reason like I needed to share with them something that I was going through. And it was amazing how all the walls came down, and I got more feedback from that class about, thank you for sharing that, because I'm right here too. And I needed that, and I needed to hear that. And so that is something that I think resonates particularly with adult learners. It's just that sense of vulnerability.
Yeah, Rick, just to add to that, I think that the pandemic especially has really brought the importance of adult SEL to the conversation, and your example there really just brings home the idea that these people, adult learners especially, who are often in professions where they're working full time, they're raising a family, a lot of them, and they're at the beginning of their career, so maybe they're not making as much money as they'd like, and there's a lot of pressure on them. So for us to be mindful as instructors about their needs, their social emotional learning needs, really becomes critical. And I think it was there before the pandemic. It's just we weren't maybe paying as much attention to it. But for me at least, your point really has emphasized the importance of, you got to take time to allow for the class culture to develop, so that there can be vulnerability, because otherwise, for me at least, it really doesn't become authentic until they feel like they can. One of the ways that they actually voice this is they just say, when we go through our class norms together, they say, yeah, we want the Vegas rule. And I'm always happy to put the Vegas rule in as our norm, because I want them to be able to feel like they can talk about stuff in my class and know that when we leave the class, it's confidential. It's for our class and the members of our class only.
Sometimes in a hybrid class in particular, I can feel like I'm spending an inordinate amount of time in that first class session on personal introductions and storytelling. And yet it is so important in terms of setting the foundation for that kind of authenticity and vulnerability, and being able to even have a platform to establish trust so that you can meet some of these needs and be aware of them, that people are even willing to share with you. Anytime that I've tried to cut that short just for the sake of driving more content, and as you know, it seems counterproductive. I feel like whatever time spent connecting always reaps benefits many times over.
I'll ditto that, Rick. You're counterproductive to cut that short. We've done the same thing, and just letting people share who they are and what's going on is very important for us.
I think too, I mean, especially in most of your teaching grad classes, I think ultimately that, creates, it's more networking, right? Like essentially you're like allowing people to create their networks at school, which is, in your programs, which is a huge part of what they probably came to do. So I think by allowing that is really helpful for sure, especially in the beginning, even though it can feel somewhat counterproductive. I even feel the same way in my undergrad class, to be honest. I have a lot of students who are pre-service teachers. They're usually a semester right before they do their teacher assisting. And a lot of them, basically make friends in my class that they go on to do teacher assisting with, that they've told me afterwards, that they've, that have been a huge asset to them going huge forward in the college of ed. So that's been another thing too. I didn't necessarily plan for that to happen that way, but I think just the way inherently I teach my class, it ended with that, which is really, really positive thing.
So as y'all were speaking, I'm thinking about themes, and it seems like when we think about engaging adult learners in the classroom, the sense of being authentic as instructors and creating space for students to be their, as they feel comfortable, their authentic selves, building a sense of community is really important. And I think it could be also, depending on the student, maybe they don't have other folks to kind of talk about what it's like to be a student while also having these other responsibilities. So the classroom kind of becomes that space to talk about all of those things. And also the wrestling with the real world, right? So there's my job that doesn't stop just because I'm in the classroom, or my family responsibilities don't stop just because I'm in the classroom. What does that mean as an instructor to create a space where those things aren't separate, right? I think that, as Rick was saying, the pandemic kind of opened our eyes a little bit more for some of us to that, when it's always been the case. Because now you're in people's homes and you're seeing the kids in the background and the, other, things going on in the background, versus when you're in person, you don't see, or you're not always aware of some of those responsibilities. So how do we make the classroom, if you're in person, a space where a student doesn't have to turn off those parts of their lives? How do you continue to bring that into the in-person space? And I think that can also come from, the language and the syllabus, right? So making sure that the syllabus is not just a space of things you can't do, but how will we learn together, right? There have been lots of conversations about, syllabi shouldn't just be a list of rules, but a conversation between the student and the environment that you're trying to create in that class. And some of that language can include acknowledging the diversity of our students' lives, and that they don't stop being parents or, employees just because they're taking our class. How do we make space for all of those things to also be in the classroom? So again, I'm thinking about assignments. In my classes, I tell students it's really important that you're not writing just to write, that you create something that you can use professionally. And I think, again, that it helps with motivation. That really helps with students. They have to do a conference proposal. My expectation is that you will submit that conference proposal next year. I've had students go on and do that. One class, we had students write, and we talked about, okay, well, how would you submit this to a journal? So the assignment was structured so that they could do that if they wanted to. Or if they're creating a program, how can you take this to your office and actually implement this program? Not that there's some technical things that, of course, you want students to learn as undergraduates or graduate students, but that all their assignments should be useful in some way so they can get that practical experience. And I think this is particularly true for adult learners when they're like, why am I doing this? Well, you now have a product that you can take to work or use in your next job search or something like that. So I think we have numerous opportunities to help students make the connection and feel like they can be all of themselves in the classroom. So
I would say this is something I did prior to pandemic, and maybe it's less important now, but one thing I always had students do, I was big into like doing video discussions. So instead of doing just text-based discussion boards, I do video discussions, and some students really balked at the idea, much less so now post-pandemic that everyone's kind of forced to be used to it. But I would always tell them, like it's super likely that your first job interview is going to be through Zoom or something like that. So like, you better get used to it anyway. So like I always like justify things like that. And that's probably not as important now that if you're not used to it now, I don't know if you ever get used to Zoom at this point, but what was the other example? Another thing I do too is I had students make a website, and really it wasn't about like making the website. It was I had them make a website, and they were just putting up like little like tips about how to use technology effectively and all this stuff. That I always say, yeah, sure, I could have just had you like turn in, Word documents to me on Blackboard, but I had them do a website and I'd explain to them, like many job postings say, you need to know how to use CMS. CMS stands for Content Management System. Basically, this website tool I'm having you use is a CMS. So like practically speaking, if you ever saw a job posting that said that, you could honestly say yes to that, even if it was just for this teeny little amount in this class. You have a tiny bit of experience, so it's pretty practical, practical thing to learn, even if it seems maybe a little bit above and beyond what students would expect normally. But I never felt like it was asking too much of them to do that. I should say too, I like, since this group mostly talks about online courses too, I would say the community stuff we talked about before, I find it's even more important in online classes, in my opinion. You don't want to just be text on a screen. You want students to know there are actual people behind that text who, by sharing the things we've all talked about, that makes a huge difference. So I think that's doubly as important in online classes.
I was going to say, one thing that I appreciate about your example too is that you're giving students the language to talk about what they do, right? That is a huge thing, I think, particularly for adult learners, to break through some of the jargon. Like, yes, you learn the jargon of your field or your discipline or whatever that is, but being able to articulate that to a variety of audiences is, I think, an under propped up skill. And so helping them understand, like, yes, I did this website, but what does this mean? Oh, it's a CMS. You know what I'm saying? Like helping students learn the transferable skills, for lack of a better word, of the work that they're doing in classes. I think that is something that we also need to get better at, or being more explicit about, like explaining to students that this is what's happening and this is what this looks like in different settings. And I think particularly adult learners, that is valuable. That's a motivation, right? That's something that will keep them thinking about, okay, this is what I'm doing outside of, I'm getting this degree. Well, this degree also will allow me to pivot in different ways, which I think is really important in today's job market, right? A lot of times people are coming back to school anyway because they may want to pivot or get additional skills, but to also get the language in the classroom to talk about those additional skills is really powerful. So
another thing I saw, I work quite a bit in the LEADS. Stephanie and I both work quite a bit in the LEADS program. And something I saw that was done by a faculty member in the statistics department, actually, is he had his students once throughout the semester in a discussion post, they had to say how they used something that was taught in the class in their job. And they all were taking this course because, for just the reasons you just mentioned, basically. And he had amazing discussion posts, students who were like worked in insurance industry and, gave like really specific examples of like how some statistical model they learned in this introductory stats class was used. And I think that was good, probably for that student, but also for the other students in the class, to see, oh, maybe, they could identify with some of the examples that were given. So I thought that was a really good example. It was interesting too, because this instructor, he almost exclusively teaches traditionally aged undergrad students, and teaching in the Adult Learner Leads program was a new thing for him, largely a new thing for him. And he was pretty skeptical. I don't know, Stephanie, if you would agree with me. I thought he was pretty skeptical, of like, the idea of discussion like this in a statistics course. And I think he quickly realized the value of it. And he was sharing a lot of those with us, which is really cool to see.
And that type of data is really powerful for future classes. Like one of the things I've done before is had students write, like, what would you tell someone taking this class next year? And I'll keep those and share it with the class coming in. It's powerful for the students writing it. And then for the students who may be nervous about taking the class, they're like, oh, wow, look at what these folks did last year. Often my in-person classes will take photos when students are presenting or doing stuff in class. So it also gives a sense of what's going to happen, which I think is also pretty powerful for students coming after who are like, especially you've been away from school for a while, like what happens in the classroom in this day and age? And you can kind of share some of that through assignments or activities like that. So
there's an instructor I work with I'll say real quick, there's an instructor I work with in management who does something similar to what you just said, Laila, where he has students at the beginning of the semester say on video, like their fears of the class, basically like what they're scared about. And then in the middle, they kind of give like an update, like progressing type of thing. And at the end, they say like what was most successful, what's most useful to them going forward. And he's really into video editing. He actually turns it into a video not every semester, but every once in a while he'll turn it into a video. And he uses that basically as a trailer for his class in upcoming classes. Students obviously they can use that, but it's really cool.
Well, I'm not as creative as that, but I'll often start off because I do policy and finance. People are scared to death, so I start out saying, "So tell me where you are between scared to death and petrified, and I'm here to teach you how to do this." And then we go through, we do a number of cases, and we've given them, all the cases have questions. And we don't pay attention to them. We give them a sort of a rubric saying, tell me how you're going to answer this for the people you work for. So we give them a tool to work with. And then in the end, through our program, we have them either write a paper. I do it with a discussion post. Tell me, now what are you going to take away from here? And then you have to comment on the students. So that gets them reflecting and talking about it. But we also do a lot of non-academic writing. So we're going to write a business plan, a marketing plan, a strategic plan, a quality plan. So lots of kinds of writing they'll be doing in their work life.
yeah, thank you, Stephanie. So using examples from prior semesters for students to get a sense of what their assignments can look like and things like that. Yes, examples are really helpful for sure. Thank you for sharing that. So that's all I had. I think we're coming up on time. Thank y'all so much for joining in on this conversation and sharing some of the great stuff that y'all are doing. I hope the information I shared was helpful. If anyone's interested in the survey that I use, I can definitely share that. It's a Qualtrics link, so I can definitely share some of those questions if you're curious.
Yeah, thanks, Laila. We really appreciate you being here this morning and sharing with us. And we'll put the recording out. It would be great if you would send me the links, so then I'll just include it with all the materials that we'll send out to everybody in the CECI college, and that'd be awesome. Such great information. Thank you so much. So relevant to the work that we're doing with our adult learners. So very appreciative of your time.